Hello and welcome back to Not Your Forte, a music education podcast geared towards music education students to help you survive and thrive throughout your undergrad. I'm Eric Tinkler, a fourth-year music education student here at Kansas State University. And as always, I'm joined by Dr. Philip Payne, the music ed chair here at K-State. And we're continuing on our series with our Conducting Bootcamp. We're really excited to continue to keep delving into all aspects of being a conductor and just being on top of that podium. Joining us this week, we have Dr. Onsby Rose from Dordt College. Dr. Rose, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Onsby Rose. I'm the Director of Instrumental Music at Dordt University in a small town of Sioux Center, Iowa, in the upper northwest corner of the state of Iowa. And this is finishing up my first year on faculty here. And other than the oddities that we're all dealing with right now, it's been an awesome year.
Awesome. Let's go ahead. Let's go a little bit in depth on you to kind of share with the listeners where you've been, what you've done. Let's just talk a little bit about kind of your background, like your quote unquote, like your autobiography or something.
Okay, sure. Well, I grew up in Virginia, born in Michigan, but don't tell any of my Ohio State compadres that. And was in high school band. I'm a trombone player by trade, I guess you could say. And just discovered that music seemed to be my calling. So I went to school at the University of South Carolina for about 3.5 years and found that I was beginning to get burned out. I wasn't burned out on music so much, but I was burned out on just going to school. So I looked into military music at the time. I had looked into it after high school and decided I wanted to go on to college, but at this time it seemed like an appealing thing. So to make a long story short, after auditions and all that stuff, I ended up joining the U.S. Marine Corps as a trombonist. So that was intended to only be a 4-year contract. But after being on active duty for a couple of years, I decided I really enjoyed it and ended up staying for 11 years when it was all said and done. So after I got out, I worked outside of the music industry for a few years, primarily because I got out in October of 2007, and it's not a good time of year to be looking for a teaching gig. So I actually was a conductor. I tell my students all the time, this is my joke line when I introduce myself to new students. I've always been a conductor. Just for 5 years, I was a conductor of a different type. I actually worked for the railroad. So I was a freight conductor. Did that for a few years, and my wife of almost 14 years passed in 2012, and that, out of necessity, projected me into a career change, which led me back into the classroom as the director of bands at Hampton High School and Middle School in Upper East Tennessee, Carter County. Had a great time there, taught in a very rural school district. It was a wonderful place with some truly incredible people. But I kind of got to a point where I needed to use my GI Bill. Otherwise, I'm of the era where it goes away after 10 years. So I went back to school for my master's degree in wind band conducting at Appalachian State. There was a lot of growing that happened there. My mentor at the time, Dr. John Ross, the director of bands, still currently there, he was very instrumental in kind of opening my eyes to some opportunity, to just music in general. This is where I met David Maslanka, who ended up being my composition mentor. And just had a really great time, and the college teaching bug kind of bit, and decided, you know what? I was getting ready to turn 40 years old when I graduated from App, and I thought, if I'm going to do this whole doctorate thing and teach college, I need to do it now because I'm not getting any younger. So went ahead and applied to D.M.A. programs, and thankfully ended up at a great school, Ohio State University, with in my opinion, I'm probably a little biased, but in my opinion, one of the best mentors I could ask for in Russ Mickelson, their director of bands, and spent 3 wonderful years there. And again, during that education period of my life, really had a lot of opportunities presented to me that would send my life down a path that I would have never dreamt before. And then after applying for literally hundreds of jobs, as I exited my doctoral program, was led here to Northwest Iowa to teach here at Dordt.
Awesome. Let's dive into a little bit about your compositional background.
Sure.
As you stated, you've always been a conductor, whether that's been of bands or of trains. Let's talk a little bit how you mentioned you were able to meet and have studied under David Maslenka. Let's talk a little bit about
Sure.
what got you into composition and what brought this branch into your life.
Well, conducting has always been my thing. I mean, I've always wanted to be a band director, if you will. And now I'm lucky enough that I get to do band and orchestra, which is incredible. But during my time at Appalachian, my mentor there, John Ross, I kept telling him how interested I was in David's music, how intriguing it was for me. Any of us that are familiar with it, we know the depth that David wrote with, just the depth of emotion in his music. And it was just something that truly I just couldn't get it off my mind. And John kept telling me, he said, Onsby, just reach out to him. David's a very kind man, and he loves to hear from people that like his music. So finally, after a little bit of nudging from John, I sent David an email and said, hey, I'm this unknown master's degree conducting student at this, little mid-sized university in North Carolina. I know that you don't have any reason to really talk to me, but I just want to let you know that your music has made a tremendous impression on me over my lifetime, and especially in the recent years. And that began a dialogue. David emailed me back. I can't remember exactly, but it was less than 24 hours. And we met at Midwest that year. And still, I was only approaching this as a conductor. I had no desire or really thought that I would ever enter into the realm of composition at that time. So we talked and continued to talk via email and over the phone over the rest of my degree there. And as I was leaving Appalachian, we met again at Midwest at the band clinic that year. And I said, I really want to commission a piece by you. I'd like to commission a symphony. And David was very interested. He said, I've been wanting to write large pieces for longer, but with his prominence, it had gotten to where it was relatively expensive to commission a full symphony from him. I said, well, that's okay. I'm just the person, because I don't know the word no, and I will find people that will help me fund it. So he said, well, let's wait and find out where you end up. If you're going to commission a work, you got to have a band to play it. I said, yeah, that makes sense. So again, to kind of make it as concise as possible, once I found out I was going to end up at Ohio State, during my first fall there, I went into Russ Mickelson, the director of bands there, and said, hey, I have this idea that I've been talking with David Maslenka about since I was a master's student, and kind of just laid it out to him. I want to commission a symphony. I'd like to write my dissertation on it, and I would like to approach it in a way that no one else has approached it before. When David and I spoke, he said, everyone has written about my compositional method, but no one has written about it from the inside looking out. All of it has been from the outside looking in. Are you willing to learn to do what I do so that you can write about it from the inside out? And I said, yeah, that would be great. I had a few minor concerns at first. Again, if you know David, you know that his spirituality was Buddhist, and I'm obviously a strong Christian. And I was unwilling to sacrifice my religious beliefs. And he said, no, that's not what this is all about. He said, I grew up in a Christian home, and again, much of his music is based upon Christian beliefs and Christian things that through Bach's music. He said, my meditation may end up for you being a prayer time, which when it all comes down to it, when we talk more about my compositional stuff, that's exactly what it ended up being. So anyway, again, long story short, I went through my doctorate, commissioned what was originally going to be Symphony Number 11. Of course, David passed in August of 2017, and ended up joining forces with Scott Hagen and Steve Steele, who had commissioned Symphony Number 10. In order to finish that up, we ended up developing this huge mega consortium. But in the process of this, David continued to coach me primarily on meditation. It really wasn't on compositional techniques so much. He coached me in, how to open my inner mind in a way into a meditative state. And that is how I entered composition. It was completely an accident. I'll never forget, I went to bed one night and I just gotten an email from Jerry Junkin at the Dallas Wind Symphony. And it was their solicitation for their fanfare competition. They've done this for years. Went to bed and it was just on my mind. And in my personal beliefs, I truly believe God he was just poking me in the shoulder saying, Onsby, you've got to try this. So, David and I had spent months at that time talking about these things, and I had tried, some meditation. My wife and kids went to bed that night, and I got back up and sat down at my computer and the piano. And by the time that I went to bed, late in the morning, 4 or 5 a.m., I had essentially written what came to be my first piece. It was for brass and percussion, called Fanfare Die Helden, which is German for our heroes. And sent it off to Dallas, sent it to the Dallas Winds. And a few weeks later, got it back, said, you have been selected as one of the winning compositions. And then I let some more band director friends of mine listen to it. They said, hey, this is great. You should add woodwinds and expand the percussion. It would make a great concert fanfare. Okay, cool. Let's give it a shot. I've been the recipient of some incredible luck / just my ability I'm a pretty outgoing personality. So I sent the wind score when I finished it to what was really more just an acquaintance at the time, but has now become a very good friend, Jason Fettig, the commander and conductor of the U.S. Marine Band, fully expecting Jason to send me an email back saying, Onsby, great try, keep up the work, you'll eventually get there. Thankfully for me, about a week and a half after I sent this to Jason, I got an email back saying, Onsby, this is great. I'd like to program this for our August 30th, 2017 Capitol Steps concert. Well, as you can imagine, that kind of was an immediate fire for my composition career. The president's own playing something. And it's not because I'm awesome. It's just because that goes a long way in letting people know that, well, at least somebody thinks my music is okay. So I thought it was going to be a one-time thing. And then folks started talking to me about possibly turning what the wind band version of Die Helden turned into being called Heroes from the Sea, which Frank Kelly actually, and I had spoke at one point, and he said, oh, this would make a great first movement to a suite. Oh, okay, cool. That's a great, if Frank Kelly says it, then I got to do it, And again, some more people, some key players, Larry Lang at the U.S. Air Force Band, said, hey, yeah, let's do a movement for the Air Forces. And then it continued to grow from there. And eventually it turned into what became my Symphony No. 1. Heroes from the Sea is actually the first movement. And then the second movement is for the Air Forces. Third movement is for the Army, for the ground forces. And then the reason it ended up not being a suite is I just felt like it was not complete without a fourth and final movement that were for our fallen soldiers. Having served 11 years in the Marine Corps, I have a number of friends that unfortunately lost their lives, and I felt very compelled to write that movement. And the fourth movement actually has become probably the favorite of the four movements. So that's kind of how I got from conducting to composition. It was a total accident. I did not plan for any of that to happen. It was completely accidental.
So I think something like really important and something to note for our listeners right here, and something we've talked about before, is the wonderful community that is the music community, whether it's music education, composition, whatever. Throughout his entire time, Dr. Rose has mentioned names such as Frank Kelly, Colonel Fettig, David Maslenka, and the fact that he reached out to these people, and I think that's really, regardless of how old you are, where you are, and stuff. Don't be afraid to reach out to these people, because there's already a foundation of something that you guys both love, and that's music. And if you reach out, you're honest and you're capable of just sending an email, sending a message, however you might do that. I highly recommend going out and do that. I'm sure Dr. Payne can agree with me on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I tell my students all the time that, don't be afraid. They put their pants on one leg at a time, just like we all do. And if they don't return your email, or if they blow you off, they're not the person you want to get advice from anyway.
Well put. So let's go ahead and let's dive into more of the meat of what we're going to talk about here today.
Sure.
So we spent the last couple of weeks. We had Dr. Wimmer on 2 weeks ago to talk about kind of the basics of conducting and stuff, what you need to know to start out. Then last week with Dr. Trace, we dived really in depth into score study, rehearsal prep, and just kind of getting ready and for your rehearsal. Now we have Dr. Rosarn, who's a conductor and been a conductor for many years, but is also a composer. And just we're going to try to get a different perspective on various aspects of conducting from a composer-conductor viewpoint. So
Sure.
kind of like leading into the first aspect of this, just let's connect to last week. How does your approach to score study, how does that shift for someone who's also a composer?
Well, I think the depth of the change, I guess, since getting more involved in composition, has been that I pay much, much closer attention to the composer's intentions, especially with notation nowadays, as to the point that we have developed. We can pretty much write quite a bit down in black and white as to what we want as a composer. Conductors have a tendency sometimes in trying to learn the entire thing, and sometimes with compressed amounts of time to do so, to overlook some things from time to time. And it's not intentional. I don't think any conductor ever intentionally tries to interpret music differently than what they feel the composer has intended for them. But, it's a big job learning an entire orchestra or band score. You've got 32 plus staves of music with lots of different things going on. So I know for me as a composer and conductor now, I tend to be a lot more thoughtful about every single mark on the page. And with the band world specifically, one of the things that I've found myself doing more often, because we are lucky that we have a vast majority of our composers that we play music by nowadays are still living, is, again, I'll reach out to them. And if I don't understand, I'll never forget Russ Mickelson at OSU always told me, one of his statements that stuck in my mind was, the unmarked note is the enemy of the conductor. Because you really don't know at that point. I mean, you can guess and think, well, he means this to be marcato or lifted or whatever you want to call it, but you really don't know. So I found myself much more often questioning myself as a conductor, because I'm looking at it now through the eyes of a composer as well, thinking, well, if I had written this, what would have I been looking for? And if I can't figure it out, which happens fairly often, then I'll reach out to whoever it is. Of course, if it's someone that is no longer alive, then I'll do my best to research performance practices and things like that. But I guess my overall answer would be is that I just give a lot more effort to interpreting it as intended by the composer.
Does that differ significantly from how you approached it prior to your composition?
I didn't feel as bad before that I started composing myself with taking more liberties. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be risky. Conductors and musicians, we need to take risk. But I'm more thoughtful about what would the composer really want, because I've had the opportunity and the great honor to work with numerous ensembles now on my own music. And the great thing about it is that they all do it differently. But on occasion, I'll run into something that is completely against what I had intended. And sometimes that's my fault, because maybe I didn't notate it well enough to relay to them what I was wanting. Or maybe the conductor decided to take some interpretive liberties with it, which I'm not against at all. But when I go out and do a residency, really, I feel like what they're paying me to do is to let them know what I wanted the music to sound like. So I try to do the same thing. Now, I will say that there are times that I'll take some liberties that maybe the composer didn't intend, because that's the great thing about music, is every performance is different. But I do find myself just putting more effort into trying to figure out what the composer wanted. If I'm going to go against the composer's wishes, then I got to know what they were to begin with.
Excellent. And my follow-up question is taking on commissions, because that was always one exciting part of being a high school band director, of joining those consortiums and really working through to commission pieces for your ensembles. What kinds of questions do you ask those directors or those consortiums about the various instrumentation capabilities? What areas you want the directors want to stretch their ensembles? Do you ask those types of questions, or is it much more global in the approach?
I do. It depends on the ensemble I'm writing for. When I wrote the symphony, especially movements 2, 3, and 4, I knew basically I was writing for some of the finest musicians in our nation, and I could write whatever I want. I mean, there were 78 ensembles in that consortium, and they were all, with the exception of just a couple, collegiate level bands or our premier military bands, and even the 2 or 3 high school groups that joined it, they were Midwest quality. So I knew that they could essentially play almost anything that I wrote. So at that point, really, I only ask, what's my limitations on instrumentation? Is it okay for me to write for contrabass, clarinet, and contrabass bassoon? Do you have a harp player? Is it reasonable for piano? Stuff like that. Now, for example, I'll just use my most recent commission. A good friend of mine in North Carolina, we actually went to school together during our master's at App State, Matthew Brousseau. He is commissioning me to write a one-movement work for his group for next year. And when we spoke on the phone to start this, of course, I asked him instrumentation, what are your quality players? If I want to write solos, who are your strongest musicians? Different things like that. How long do you want it to be? Being a band director myself, we all kind of are used to dealing with that grading system of 1 through 6. So that's kind of a general thing. I mean, I try not to place too many limitations on myself, but I ask, what grade level do you want this to be in? Is there any specific sections you'd like me to avoid being exposed? Just general ideas like that. And then what I like to try to do is, as I write, I will send the director a few things, my ideas, or if I get to a point where I'm writing something that I feel, well, this might be questionable based upon what we have discussed previously, then I'll reach out and say, hey, I'm thinking about writing this. Do you think that's doable? Even if it's going to be challenging, is it something that you think you can achieve, or should I try to rethink the orchestrations or what have you? Most directors are pretty good in that they don't want to place any unneeded limitations on a composer, which I greatly appreciate. It's not very often that any composer gets asked by an ensemble that you literally are just told, write whatever you want, especially when dealing with educational ensembles, as we do most often in the band world. But yeah, those are generally the type of things. The most uncomfortable part of a commission is talking about the money. That's a challenging part, and I'm very lucky. I say this only representing myself, because I don't think this is applicable to every composer out there. I've got a day gig. I'm lucky in that I've got a wonderful teaching position here at Dordt that allows me to live what I think of as a relatively comfortable life. Therefore, I can be far more flexible on my commissioning rate. And I'm just honored that people want to play my music. So I still believe that I'm worth, I've got to make some money because, my music is worth something, but I think I can be a little bit more flexible. So that makes the money conversation a little bit easier, as well as looking at it from a band director's eyes as well. I have to deal with budgets for my own group every day. So those are kind of the things that we generally talk about in most conversations when someone talks to me about commission, as well as timeline. When's the drop dead of a score and parts in your hand, in order for you to perform this at the time that you want to.
So let's go ahead. Let's shift from a composer and an idea. Let's talk about literature selection. I think Dr. Payne and I we need to do a more in-depth episode on this one day. But just talk about how you, being a composer, now influences your literature selection for your ensembles.
Well, I'm actually, it's a good question for me right at the moment. I'm actually giving a full hour lecture at the Iowa Bandmasters on next week based on programming for ensembles. And I've had a way of kind of looking at it for the past few years to try to make sure that I balance things out. We're lucky in the band world that we have a tremendous amount of wonderful, really, really well-written music that is new. It's very tempting to just program everything that's the newest, hottest thing out. But that's not what's most educationally balanced for our students. And even as a composer that's writing new music, I understand that. So this is kind of a hokey way to look at it, but I've got this little blurb that I use. It's called Old, New, Borrowed, Blue, and a March. And I think that really sums it up. Generally on any high school collegiate level band concert, you'll probably play somewhere between 4 to 7 pieces. And if you can balance that out to where you have something old, so for example, in the wind band world, that might mean something by Claude T. Smith or Alfred Reed or one of the Holt suites, something that has been around that's kind of a staple of band literature. Something new, there's plenty to choose from there. You might play something by a living composer, you know, the John Mackeys of the world that are just out there writing this incredible music. Something borrowed, which can be a lot of different things. Borrowed meaning a transcription possibly. And it doesn't have to be an orchestral transcription. For example, the Robert Reynolds transcription of O Magnum Mysterium from choir to band, that would be something borrowed. Something blue can, you know, that can fit a lot of different concepts. And many of these things, you'll pick a piece. I find myself programming something and it fits more than one category. So I actually do like three separate things for each piece to make sure that I'm still being well balanced. But something blue could be, you know, again, to use John's music, Hymn to a Blue Hour, Blue Shades. Both of those have the word blue in it, but that doesn't mean it has to have the word blue. You could do a transcription of, say, the Barber's Adagio for strings, and that would be blue because it's slow and kind of very emotional music, and it would also be borrowed. And then, of course, I firmly believe this, I truly believe that on every concert there should be a march. The march is, in my opinion, the single most important building block of wind band literature. They've been being written for ages, and I just don't think you can have a truly balanced band concert. And it doesn't have to be Sousa. It can be a new march. I'm doing one next year by a composer friend of mine, Frank Galino, called Spirit of Victory. It's a wonderful, wonderful new march. But playing a march of some sort, because a band, especially at the collegiate and high school level, students need to know how to interpretively and properly play the march form.
All right, let's. So I saw that you've recently been appointed the conductor of the Northwest Iowa Symphony Orchestra.
Uh-huh.
So how does that mindset change between band to orchestra in terms of the kind of things we've already discussed?
Well, you know, the biggest thing for me is it just allows me to enter into a realm of literature that I've not been able to get into as often before. You know, we're going to do some major orchestral works next year, Beethoven 7, the Beethoven Piano Concerto No. 5, but we're also doing, you know, Jim Stevenson's Third Symphony, which is for orchestra. So really the exciting thing for that is that it opens up this whole new world of literature. A lot of people, you know, we have this overarching thought that, oh, well, he's a band conductor, or, oh, he's an orchestra conductor. Conducting is conducting. Music is music. Whether you're drawing a bow across strings, or whether you're vibrating a column of air through a trombone, or whether you're striking an instrument with some sort of a mallet, music is music. Conducting is conducting. Now, does that mean that I don't have to know some string pedagogy and making sure that I can communicate in a consistent way with my string players because they don't speak entirely the same language pedagogically? No, of course you need to be up on those things, but music is music. So standing in front of an orchestra, albeit I'll have some different colors that I haven't had obviously with bands, we're still going to be making music together. So that's the great thing about that, and just the addition of all this wonderful repertoire.
Really exciting.
One of the things we've talked about, we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered composing, we've covered conducting, we've covered performing, and a lot of the different hats that we wear as musicians, whether we're public school musicians, composers, conductors, all of those things. How do you avoid burnout? Being able to push yourself and burn the candle on both ends. What do you do to keep that candle burning bright?
Sure. No, I totally understand. It's very challenging, especially, we're not just musicians. I'm the father of 5 boys, and I have a wife whom I love dearly. And it's very difficult to balance those things. I can kind of give you my answer at the end of next academic year. Ask me again, because I'm taking on a 4th ensemble next year, and we'll see how that goes. I'll be doing our chamber orchestra here at Dordt, in addition to our 2 wind bands plus the Northwest Iowa Symphony. So, for me, it kind of comes in seasons. My wife and my kids know that come August 25th, I think it is next year, that I'm going to go into high gear as far as my job goes. And I still try to attend my kids' band concerts and soccer games and all that stuff, but I'm not at every one of them. I have a very kind, forgiving, and understanding family, and they know that, for the majority of Monday through Friday and most Saturdays, I'm pretty much at work 8 to 10 hours a day. I found this year, when it comes to balancing composition in with that, I can't do as much writing during the academic year, just because that I'm so busy learning scores and rehearsing ensembles and teaching music ed classes. So most of my composition comes in the summer, but I can do that in my leisure time. When my wife is in her sewing room sewing, I can be composing, things like that. But anyway, once we get to the end of the first semester, I usually go to the Midwest Clinic. And then when I get home from there, I do everything in my power to not touch anything work related until it's time to go back to work in January. I do all of my score study in the summer, so I'm already ready to go as far as my second semester. And then once January hits again, of course we're back at it again until about the 1st of May. And then when the 1st of May hits, for example, today we did commencement, and I'll go in for a meeting here and there, and I'll have a few things that I have to take care of. But the vast majority of my time will be waking up in the morning and spending the time with my family. So I try to give that time back in the summer. We have lots of hobbies that we enjoy. We do a lot of camping. We have an RV that we love to travel around the country in. So I try to spend that time with them during the summer. So that's the way that I balance. Now, that doesn't mean that will work for everyone, but I think the key thing is for each person to find how it is that they can balance. And there does come a point where you have to realize if you've got too much. When I took on the chamber orchestra going into next academic year, I told my department chair, I said, I'm happy to try this for a year, but if I find that I just can't handle it, I don't want to do anything bad. I don't want to shortchange our musicians. So if I find that I can't handle 2 bands, a chamber orchestra and a large orchestra, then we're going to have to go back to having an adjunct or hiring another full-time professor to help me out. So that's kind of how I go about it, is you have to be honest with yourself, which is easy not to. It's easy to say, but I want to make this music. I want to play. I want to give these kids everything. But there are other things in life that have to be just as important.
Ty, you mentioned a little bit about it, but also us thinking, what is your process for score study? How do you first approach it? Do you go big picture to little picture? Are you looking for specific items whenever you're perusing scores? What's kind of your process?
A little bit of both. I do my score study in a method that's very similar to my rehearsal process, in that I rehearse in an hourglass shape, or I look at a score when I'm initially looking at it in an hourglass shape. I'll first look at big picture items. For example, I'm in the process now of trying to find music for all of my ensembles to play next year. So I'm listening to a ton of music. I'm looking through a ton of scores. Mostly at first, I'm looking at big picture of, will this fit in a concert? Is this something that is reasonably playable by my musicians, or that I can teach them for it to be reasonably playable? and any of those technical challenges along the way. And as well as I'll make a list of all these things I'm considering, because you might find 5 or 6 pieces that are great for the wind symphony to play, but they may not all fit together on a concert very well. The flow of the concert is a very important concept. So then I'll start narrowing it down to figure out what tunes can go on each concert. As far as the study itself, yeah, it's a pretty basic Frank Battisti way of looking at scores. I mean, I teach out of Frank's books in my conducting classes. I look at big picture, and then I will eventually go to the piano and slowly play through parts individually on their own, beginning to put them back together to where that I can audiate them in my head without the piano. I mean, I kind of go in families at a time, so I'll do that for the woodwinds, then the brass, then the percussion, or if it's for orchestra, I'll add strings in there. And then I'll slowly go back and try to piece those together in my head so that I understand the score. At the same time, I'm beginning to mark my score. I'm beginning to make notes as to, I believe this is going to take a certain amount of time in rehearsal. And I'm kind of a math geek when it comes to that stuff. In that, if I've got a 10-minute piece, or better yet, if I know that I'm playing 40 minutes of music on any given concert, then I'll go back and total up how many hours of rehearsal I have, figure out how many minutes I have per minute of music to be performed. And then, of course, that doesn't always even out perfectly. If you're performing Maslenka 4 like we are next year, then I'm going to spend a lot more time on that than I will something easier. But that's kind of how I go about it. And hopefully, my hope is that by the time that I step on the podium the very first time to sight read the piece with my band or with my orchestra, that I'm sick of it. By the time my musicians actually put notes into the air, I'm ready to get away from it. And if I feel like that when I step on the podium, then I'm prepared, hopefully well enough. If I'm still trying to learn the piece, there's a few pieces in the world that I'd probably never get to that. Symphony No. 4 by David is one of them. I'll never tire of that. I could play that for the rest of my life every day, and I would still love it every minute. But for most pieces, you get to a point where it's like, whew, I want to be done with this. I aim for my score study to get me to that point at my first rehearsal. And then that means that I know that score inside out.
So you mentioned that you teach a conducting class. And this is going to be a little bit more of a vague kind of question and stuff, but how do you approach teaching your beginning conducting classes as a composer and a conductor of both band and orchestra?
Well, I'm lucky and unique in the fact that both my beginning and advanced conducting class, not only do I have soon to be band and orchestra directors in there, but I also have choral conductors. I teach all 3 areas in both classes because we're a relatively small department, and it's not feasible for us to split them up. So I approach it in a way that, first off, my biggest concern is I want them to learn to be a functional conductor. I was not a functional conductor in my first high school teaching position. My band was okay. They sounded good, but as far as me being anything to look at, I gave them nothing to look at. I could get them started and get them stopped. So I try to give them a little bit beyond that. I don't expect my undergraduates to come out of my advanced conducting course looking like someone that's just finished a doctoral program. I expect them to be able to have a level of understanding to the point that they can feasibly conduct a good high school band, and that they can continue to grow as a conductor. Really, the challenge in teaching conducting at the collegiate level is there's just never enough time in front of a real ensemble. We're lucky here in that I've been able to find some places where I've been able to get more time than what I normally would, but you don't become a better conductor by talking about it. You can become a better conductor by standing in front of live musicians conducting, because that's the only way you can get that immediate feedback. So I try to do that as much as I can. And then, hopefully they have gained enough experience and enough knowledge by the time that they graduate and have their own ensemble that they can functionally conduct, and then they can continue to grow from there by going to conducting symposiums during the summers, and different things like that. I mean, I try to go beyond floor, door, wall, ceiling, but I also understand that reasonably in 2 semesters of conducting, you're not going to be Toscanini.
Right.
So kind of as we kind of continue to wrap up and kind of get near the end of the episode here. So
Sure.
there's a big elephant in the room, and kind of just like how the world is right now with
Sure.
every day, and that's COVID-19.
Right.
And that's something that's impacted not just people in music, but people everywhere throughout the world. As we continue to go through this kind of time of uncertainty and stuff, going into the summer and potentially really mystery of what the fall semester might look like.
Right.
What do you think the biggest thing that college students can do right now to continue to stay connected with both their peers or teachers and also with music?
Well, the connect is the key word there. That's something that I've tried to do over the final 8 weeks of our semester, is to stay connected. There's never going to be a way, or not in our lifetime, I don't think, to replicate the experience of performing or singing, playing in an ensemble with live people at your left and right. My choral colleague here just did an incredible virtual choir of our alma mater for our commencement service, and it was wonderful. But yet that's still 54 choristers at home by themselves singing into a microphone. So I think the best thing that they can do is do as much of that stuff as you can, but remember what it felt like. Try to keep reminding yourself what it feels like to play in an ensemble or to sing in an ensemble. I've told my students here throughout our last half of the semester, we have met regularly via Zoom and all of the technology options that we have. And that's what I've talked about with them is, do you remember when we played this? How did you feel? Because my goal is for them to remember the emotive quality of that. And I truly believe, I know there was a meme of some sort floating around on social media long ago, within a few weeks ago, that said something about, the first time that we're able to be back together in an ensemble playing again, we'll probably not be able to play because everyone will have tears in their eyes. And I truly believe that. And if we get to that point, if there's tears in my musician's eyes at the first downbeat that I give in the fall, God willing, and we're able to be together, then I think that I've been successful in helping them remember what that's all about. When we come out of all this, as much as it has just been terrible to go through it, I think the silver lining to it all, or I pray the silver lining to it all, is that we'll appreciate those experiences far more. The last piece that we played on my Wind Symphony concert here, right before we went on spring break and then unfortunately never came back from, was the first movement of Maslenka's Ninth Symphony. And it was a great performance. And I've listened to that piece over and over and over throughout this time to remind myself, this is what it's all about. Was every note perfectly in tune? No. Was everything played perfect? No. But boy, it was musical, and it was emotional, and it was deep. And that's what the students have to remember, because that's why we do music. That's what makes music great.
So one of our final questions here also, if you had one piece of advice, what would be the Dr. Roseism that you would pass on to our listeners here of Not Your Forte podcast?
Work hard. And, for those that are seeking to become conductors, band directors, orchestra directors, learn to play your instrument or sing your voice part to the absolute highest quality that you possibly can. Because every single second, every single amount of your musical ability on your instrument translates to the podium. If you are a great musician behind the horn, you will be a great musician when standing in front of 100 of them. So just work very hard. And, in addition to that, try to remember that even through the challenging times, that there is still good there. To be kind to everyone. We live in a very small community of musicians, and you know, we've all got our little piece of the pie, and we're trying to do it. But sometimes I see you know, colleagues and friends that get frustrated with each other, and you know, it causes some rub between them. Just love on everybody. That's what it's all about, is that, you know, we might see things a different way, we might not always agree, but the bottom line is that we're all aiming for the same goal. We all want to make great music and teach students to enjoy and enrich their lives by having that as part of it. So yep, hard work, being kind to people, and just becoming the best musician possible.
Really awesome, phenomenally put. Dr. Rose, before we kind of end here, do you have anything upcoming that you want to share with the listeners? Any compositions, anything you're speaking at?
Well, I'm doing the programming thing at Iowa Bandmasters on the 14th. It's actually a virtual conference this year because of our situation. You know, I mentioned the commission that I'm doing for East Lincoln High School in North Carolina. And I'm slowly starting to begin work on my second symphony. I haven't, it's not really gotten ink on the page yet, but lots of ideas and things moving towards that I think probably not this summer, but next summer, I'll probably be ready to start on that. So if anybody's interested in another symphony, they can keep their ears open for that, I guess.
Awesome. And any way our listeners can reach out to you if they have any further questions or anything?
Absolutely. I love to get emails from people. One of the things that I promised David before he passed was that I would do my best to pass on, to pay it forward as to what he had done for me, in that he gave me his time. So I'm always open. Folks can email me at onsby.rose@dordt.edu. It's spelled O-N-S as in Sam, B as in boy, Y, .ROSE, just like the flower, at Dordt, which is D as in dog, O as in Oscar, D as in dog, or R as in Romeo, D as in dog, T. So DORDT.edu. And, you know, they can email me there. And if we, you know, if we get to the point where it's going to be easier to have a phone conversation, I'm always happy to talk to people on a phone as well. Email is the best place to reach me, just because I check it about 1,000 times a day, and I try to be good about returning them.
Awesome.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always great to have multiple perspectives, and I know our listeners appreciate it. And hopefully some or many will reach out and visit with you further. And
absolutely.
To our listeners, again, thank you for listening. This is our third installment in Conductors Bootcamp. Our next installment is going to be Mrs. Diane Kapsulis from Clark County in Nevada. So we're really excited. She teaches in the Las Vegas area, so we're really excited to have her on to talk a little bit about the public school perspective. So we look forward to having you all back for episode 12, and we will close with episode 13 with Dr. Mike Reiber from formerly from the University of Oklahoma and now at Mustang Central Middle School. So again, be sure you look us up anywhere podcasts are available, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube, Spotify. Rate us 5 stars so that we're easier to find, and we cannot wait to see you back on Not Your Forte podcast.